Have you ever felt like life pushed you over the edge and then just kept pushing? Like you were dropped into freezing water with absolutely no idea how to survive down there? Yeah. Today's story begins exactly like that. A young woman was betrayed and thrown into the ocean by the person who was supposed to protect her, cutting her fingers off as she tried to cling to the edge of the boat. And from that unimaginable trauma, she became a goddess. Welcome back, fellow mages, to the Grounded Mage, where we explore how myth and magic exist in everyday life. Today, we're diving, literally, to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean to meet Sedna, the Inuit goddess of the sea, marine animals, and survival itself. But this episode isn't just about mythology. It's about trauma, transformation, and the strange psychological truth that sometimes the parts of us that get cut off become the very things that sustain us. So, grab your metaphorical diving gear, fellow mages, because today we are going deep. Let's get into it. In many Inuit traditions, Sedna begins as a young woman living with her father in the harsh Arctic world. Different versions of this story exist because Indigenous storytelling is living tradition, but a few key elements remain the same. Sedna marries someone she shouldn't. Sometimes it's a mysterious hunter, sometimes it's a shapeshifter, sometimes it's a bird spirit pretending to be human. Either way, the marriage is a trap. Her husband turns out to be cruel, monstrous, or not what he claimed to be at all. Eventually, Sedna escapes and returns to her father. But when her furious husband chases them across the sea, something shocking happens. Sedna's father panics. The storm rages, the boat threatens to capsize, and in a moment of pure survival instinct, he throws Sedna overboard. She grabs the side of the boat, and then, depending on the telling, her father cuts her fingers off one by one. They fall into the ocean and transform into animals: seals, walruses, whales, the very creatures the Inuit people rely on to survive. Sedna sinks beneath the waves and becomes the ruler of the sea, the keeper of marine life, the goddess who must be appeased for hunters to eat. Which, first of all, that's one of the most intense origin stories ever. Second, psychologically speaking, it's incredibly powerful because Sedna's story is about what happens after betrayal. There's a concept in psychology called betrayal trauma theory, developed by psychologist Jennifer Freyd. Freyd found something fascinating. When someone who depends on a caregiver is betrayed by that caregiver, the brain sometimes suppresses or dissociates from the trauma in order to survive. Why? Because acknowledging the betrayal could threaten the relationship needed for survival. Think about this. A child who experiences abuse and also recognizes it as abuse, because there is a difference, from a parent may respond with withdrawing. Sometimes the parent will respond to that withdrawal with more withdrawal. And that does not benefit the child's need for survival at all. So the child will isolate that event and be blind to that betrayal, simply so they can get their basic survival needs met. Something magical that the brain is doing here, and something that's also a little terrifying, is it's adapting. Sedna's story reflects that exact dynamic. The person meant to protect her, her father, becomes the source of her harm. And yet, the story doesn't end with Sedna drowning. Instead, she becomes powerful. Which brings us to one of my favorite psychological frameworks: post-traumatic growth. Before we go further, pause for a moment and ask yourself, when has something painful in your life eventually turned into a source of strength or wisdom? Not immediately. Growth rarely happens right away, but sometimes the thing that almost destroys us transforms us. Sedna is a mythological embodiment of that process. After her fall, Sedna lives at the bottom of the ocean. And here's where the story gets fascinating. In Inuit tradition, when hunters stop catching animals, it's believed that Sedna is angry, or hurt, or neglected. It's believed that when she feels this way, she calls her animals, the ones responsible for sustaining the lives of the Inuit people, down to the ocean floor. This forces a shaman to spiritually travel to her and do something very specific. They must comb Sedna's hair. Because Sedna no longer has fingers, she can't do it herself. So when her hair becomes tangled, she grows furious, taking it out on the people who represent those who wronged her. Once her hair has been gently combed, she feels better. And she lets the animals return to the surface so they can be hunted once more. Now, if you're thinking, okay, that's symbolic of something psychological, you're absolutely right. But here's the twist most people miss. Sedna isn't just a trauma story. She's also a story about emotional regulation. And if you've ever had emotions like a raging ocean, Sedna might actually explain your brain better than modern psychology does. Let's talk about that. There's a psychological concept called affect regulation, basically the ability to manage and process emotions. When we experience trauma, that system gets disrupted. Instead of emotions flowing like waves, they crash like storms. People who experience trauma mostly end up in one of two states, either on a constant high alert and easily overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, and fear, or they become completely numb and detached. There are also some people who have extreme swings between both of these states. So, for anyone who knows someone who has experienced a traumatic event, give them grace. The brain doesn't just go back to normal after something like that. It wants to protect itself. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, describes trauma as something that gets stuck in the nervous system. Sedna is the perfect metaphor for that. She sits at the bottom of the ocean, her hair tangled, her anger building until someone helps her untangle it. That's therapy, that's emotional processing, that's journaling, reflection, conversation, meditation, all the ways we comb the hair of our own inner Sedna. Pause again and ask yourself, what emotions have been tangled for me lately? Anger, grief, resentment, and more importantly, what helps you untangle them? Because ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. They just fall deeper into the ocean. Now, let's talk about the most haunting moment in Sedna's story. Her fingers falling into the sea, which then become animals. This is one of the most striking transformation symbols in mythology. Something lost becomes something life-giving. And this aligns beautifully with research on meaning making after trauma. Before I mention this next study, it's important to note that not all people who experience trauma are incapable of moving on. Yes, they often end up with heightened states of emotions, but it doesn't make them incapable of experiencing beautiful things in life. Psychologist Richard Tedeschi, who helped pioneer the study of post-traumatic growth, found many survivors of hardship report 5 major positive changes after trauma: greater appreciation of life, stronger relationships, increased personal strength, new possibilities, and spiritual development. In other words, sometimes the things that get cut off in our lives become the seeds of something entirely new. Just like Sedna's fingers becoming whales and seals, loss turned into sustenance. Pain turned into provision. Consider this next question carefully. Is there something you lost that eventually created space for something new? A job, a relationship, a belief? Sometimes mythology reminds us that transformation doesn't always look pretty. Sometimes it looks like being thrown into the ocean. There is another psychological layer here. Sedna eventually becomes the authority of the sea. Hunters must respect her, appease her, honor her, which is interesting when you consider how powerless she was at the start of her story. Many trauma survivors go through something similar, and psychologists call this boundary reconstruction. After betrayal, people often learn, sometimes painfully, how to set stronger boundaries. Sedna becomes the ultimate boundary setter. No respect? Fine then. No animals, no food, no survival. She controls the ecosystem, which is basically the mythological equivalent of treat me properly or there will be consequences. Honestly, that's iconic. Here's something else to ask yourself. Where in your life do you need stronger boundaries right now? Because sometimes being the ruler of your own ocean means deciding who and what gets access to it. Sedna isn't just an ancient myth. She's a reminder that humans have always tried to understand suffering, survival, and transformation. And Inuit cultures understood something psychologists are only recently rediscovering. Healing often requires community involvement. Often we experience trauma alone, and that makes it tough to rely on others on the other side of it. What we need to remember is this: getting through it alone is a feat, but there are people who genuinely want to help you heal, and it's really important that you let them. It feels better when someone wants to hear us out. Remember, talking about our trauma is therapeutic and actually proven to help us feel better. It helps you process and validate what you've been through. Sharing your story helps you to reclaim your narrative, moving from I'm a victim to I'm a survivor. The shaman combing Sedna's hair represents collective care. In other words, we're not meant to untangle everything alone. Sedna's story begins with betrayal and loss, but it ends with power, balance, and life. She becomes the keeper of animals, the regulator of the ecosystem, the goddess at the bottom of the sea, which means the deepest, darkest part of the story becomes the place where life begins. And that, fellow mages, is some serious grounded magic. I will leave you with one final question. What part of your life feels like the bottom of the ocean right now? And what power might be waiting for you there? If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, follow, or share this episode with a fellow mythology nerd who loves a good psychological deep dive. And if this episode made you think differently about your own storms, that's exactly the point. Because mythology isn't just about ancient gods. It's about us. Next week, we are shifting from the frozen ocean to one of the most brilliant and dangerous minds in comic book history. We'll be exploring the psychology of Doctor Doom. Genius, ego, trauma, and why sometimes the villain thinks they're the hero. You won't want to miss that one. Until next week, fellow mages, make it make magic.